My world had become defined by small, cruel sounds, the crack of ice against the window panes, the wheeze of wind through gaps in the rotting wood, the hollow growl of my own empty stomach. 3 months in this tomb, and I had learned to mark time by the rituals of survival. Wake before dawn to gather frozen kindling from the woodpile before my fingers went numb. Boil snow in the dented pot over a fire that never seemed warm enough. Brew weak tea from pine needles that tasted like despair and tannin. Eat nothing because there was nothing to eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard his voice. Edravos, Alpha King, the man whose judgment had become the soundtrack of my nightmares. You are a taint upon this pack, Calith. Your very existence is a curse we can no longer bear. His words had echoed through the great hall while the pack watched in silence, their faces a mixture of pity and relief that it was me on trial and not them. The guards had dragged me out before I could speak, before I could defend myself against accusations I still didn't fully understand. Forbidden magic, corruption of the bloodline, crimes I had never committed, pronounced by a council I had once trusted. The frozen wastes were supposed to be my grave. Everyone knew that. No shelter adequate for winter, no game to hunt, no mercy from the elements, just slow starvation and the cold creeping into your bones until you stopped feeling anything at all. I was staring into the dying embers of my fire, wondering if tonight would be the night I simply let it go out, when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the wind or the ice or my own labored breathing. Heavy, desperate. The wet rasp of something dragging itself through snow, scratching at my door. My healer's instinct flared before my survival sense could smother it. I crossed the cabin in 3 steps and pulled the latch, and the blizzard's fury slammed into me like a fist. Through the swirl of white, I saw her. A mountain of black fur collapsed against my threshold, her massive body heaving with each breath. Ice clung to her coat in thick sheets, and her amber eyes locked onto mine with an intelligence that froze me in place. This was no ordinary wolf. I dropped to my knees in the snow, my hands already reaching for her, and that's when I felt it beneath the matted fur. Warmth. Life. Her belly was grotesquely swollen, moving with the shift of pups inside. She was pregnant, and she was dying. I pulled back the fur around her neck to check for wounds, and my breath caught. There, glinting dully in the dim light from my cabin, was a collar of silver thread woven with intricate knotwork. At its center, stamped into polished metal, was the royal crest of the Alpha King. My hands began to shake. This wasn't just a wolf. This was a royal guardian, a member of Edravos' own inner circle, a creature of legend who served only the highest members of the pack. And she had crawled through a killing blizzard to reach the one person the king had thrown away. What did they do to you? I whispered. But I already knew. The same thing they had done to me. They had sent her here to die where no one would ask questions, where no one would bear witness. But unlike me, she carried something they feared enough to kill for. I looked into those intelligent amber eyes and saw the same desperate plea I had once made in the great hall, the words that had fallen on deaf ears. Save them. The goddess hadn't sent her here by accident. She had sent her here because I was the only one left who would fight. I believe you're enjoying this story. Kindly tell me your name, the city you're watching from, and what time it is for you in the comment below. I dragged her inside with strength I didn't know I still possessed, her massive weight leaving a trail of crimson across the warped floorboards. Her breathing came in ragged gasps, each exhale a wheeze that rattled in her chest like broken glass. I grabbed what little I had, torn cloth, melted snow, the last precious herbs hanging from the rafters, and began cleaning the wounds that crisscrossed her flanks. The moment I peeled back the matted fur, the scent hit me. bitter almonds mixed with something sweeter, more cloying. My hands froze mid-motion, and my heart began hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack through bone. I knew that smell. Every healer knew that smell. Wolfsbane ash. I leaned closer, forcing myself to breathe it in, praying I was wrong. But the distinctive sweetness confirmed what I already knew in my gut. This wasn't a toxin you stumbled upon in the wild. This wasn't something used by rogues or rival packs. Wolfsbane ash was refined, controlled, and kept under lock and key in the High Council's vaults. It was slow-acting and agonizing, designed to look like natural causes by the time the victim finally died. They had poisoned her, not just to kill her, but to ensure she died far from the capital, alone in the wilderness, where her body would never be found, where her pups would die with her, erased from existence before they ever drew breath. The wolf's amber eyes found mine, and in them I saw a plea that shattered what remained of my carefully constructed walls. She wasn't asking me to save her. She was asking me to save them. My hands trembled as I reached for the small blade I kept for cutting herbs. There was only one way to filter poison this deep in the bloodstream, only one way to pull it out before it reached the pups, the same forbidden magic that had gotten me exiled in the first place. Blood weaving. The High Council called it corruption. They said Omega blood was too weak, too tainted to be used in healing. But I knew the truth they'd buried beneath their lies. Omega blood didn't corrupt. It purified. It could filter toxins, absorb curses, cleanse corruption from the very soul. That's why they feared us. That's why they'd spent generations convincing the packs that we were worthless. I pressed the blade against my palm and drew it across in one quick motion. Pain flared hot and bright, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't afford to. Blood welled up, amber bright in the firelight, and I pressed my hand against the deepest wound on her flank. The moment our blood touched, the world exploded. Images slammed into my mind with the force of a physical blow. I saw 3 pups, their coats shimmering between obsidian black and something else, something other. Their eyes blazed molten gold, ancient and terrible and beautiful. I saw them standing on a cliff overlooking a burning kingdom, and I couldn't tell if they were its saviors or its executioners. Fire and ash rained from the sky. Wolves howled. The earth split open like a wound. And then I saw them again, older now, standing before a throne with their heads bowed. Peace, prosperity, a kingdom healed, 2 futures, 2 paths, salvation or annihilation. The vision released me as suddenly as it had come, and I collapsed against the wolf's side, gasping for air. My hand burned where our blood had mingled, the skin glowing faintly with amber light as the poison began to filter through me and out of her. I understood now. These weren't just pups. They were prophecy given flesh, and I had just bound my fate to theirs. The wind shifted. It was a small thing, barely noticeable over the howl of the blizzard, but my body recognized it before my mind could process why. The hairs on the back of my neck rose, and a primal part of me, the part that remembered what it meant to be prey, screamed at me to run. Then the scent hit me like a fist to the chest. Cedarwood. Ozone. And beneath it all, the unmistakable musk of an alpha in a rage so profound it warped the very air around him. My knees buckled, and I had to catch myself against the wall to keep from collapsing. I knew that scent. I had spent years in the capital learning to recognize it, to avoid him when it flared, to keep my head down and my presence small. At Dravos. The Alpha King was close. Too close. I staggered to the frost-covered window and peered through the ice-clouded glass. There, flickering between the trees like malevolent spirits, I saw them. Torches. At least a dozen, moving in formation through the forest with the precision of trained hunters, his elite guard, the ones who had dragged me from the great hall, the ones who would kill me on sight if he gave the order. My hand pressed against the glass, and I watched as the torchlight drew closer. The wolf behind me let out a low, pained whine, and I realized with cold certainty what was happening. He was tracking her, following the trail of blood she'd left through the snow, the scent of her distress, the psychic bond that connected all royal guardians to their alpha. But something was wrong. The energy radiating from him wasn't the cold calculation of a king hunting down a rogue asset. It was raw, desperate, the kind of grief-soaked fury that came from losing something precious, something irreplaceable. I closed my eyes and let my healer senses reach out, reading the emotional signatures the way I'd been trained to before the council had forbidden it. What I felt made my blood run cold. He thought she'd been taken, kidnapped, stolen by something monstrous. The High Council had lied to him. Of course they had. They couldn't tell him they'd poisoned his own royal guardian, couldn't admit they'd tried to murder whatever she carried in her womb. So they'd spun a story, something that would send him into a protective rage, something that would make him hunt through a killing blizzard without asking questions. And when he found her here, bleeding on my floor with my forbidden magic glowing in her wounds, he wouldn't see a healer trying to save a life. He would see a kidnapper, a traitor, the very monster they'd told him about. He would kill me without hesitation. The wolf's breathing grew more labored behind me, and I turned to look at her. Her amber eyes were fixed on mine, pleading. The pups inside her shifted, their tiny forms visible beneath her distended belly. They were running out of time. The blood weaving had filtered most of the poison, but she was weak, exhausted, barely clinging to life. She needed hours of careful tending, warmth, rest. I had minutes at best. The choice crystallized before me with brutal clarity. I could douse the fire, hide her in the back room, pray he didn't search too carefully. Let her suffer in silence while I played the part of the obedient exile, alone and harmless. She might survive. The pups might survive. Or I could stay, keep healing her, face him when he kicked down my door and let him see the truth with his own eyes, that I wasn't a monster, that the real monsters were the ones who'd sent us both here to die. The first option was survival. The second was suicide. I looked at the wolf, at the life trembling in her belly, at the prophecy I'd seen burning behind my eyelids. 2 futures. 2 paths. I made my choice. I fed more wood to the fire until it blazed bright enough to be seen through the windows. I positioned myself between the wolf and the door, my bloodied palms still glowing faintly with amber light. When the Alpha King came for his guardian, he would find me standing. Let him see what his council had done. Let him see what they'd tried to destroy. The torches reached the edge of the clearing. Through the window, I saw his silhouette, massive and terrible, backlit by flame. The door shuddered under the weight of his fist. I didn't move. Let him come. The blizzard chose that moment to transform from storm to apocalypse. The wind became a living thing, howling with such ferocity that the cabin walls groaned under the assault. Snow battered the windows like fists demanding entry, and beneath it all, masked by nature's fury, I heard the wolf's breathing change. A contraction rippled through her massive body, so powerful I could see it move beneath her, fur like a wave. Her legs spasmed, and a low, guttural sound tore from her throat, not quite a howl, not quite a scream. The pups were coming. No, I breathed, pressing my hands against her distended belly. Not now, not yet. You're too weak. But her body didn't care about timing or weakness or the Alpha King standing outside my door. The poison had done its work too well. Her muscles were sluggish, paralyzed, unable to push with the force needed to bring life into the world. Another contraction came, and this time she couldn't even make a sound. Her amber eyes rolled back, and I felt her consciousness start to slip away. The torches were closer now. I could hear voices shouting orders, boots crunching through snow. They would be at my door in minutes. I made a choice that would either save us or kill us all. I pressed my bloodied palms together and began to weave. The amber light that had been a faint glow intensified, spreading up my arms like living fire. I shaped it with my will, with every scrap of training the council had tried to beat out of me, pulling it outward until it formed a dome of shimmering golden light that enclosed the entire cabin. A soul shield. The most forbidden magic an Omega could perform. It bent light, muffled sound, masked heat signatures. To the trackers outside, the cabin would appear cold, dark, abandoned. But maintaining it was like holding back an avalanche with my bare hands. I felt my energy draining, pouring out of me like blood from an open wound. My vision blurred at the edges, dark spots dancing across my sight. "Stay with me," I gasped to the wolf, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to her or myself. "Just a little longer." I positioned myself at her hindquarters and reached inside, my fingers finding the first pup's form. It was small, so impossibly small, and for a terrible moment I thought it was already dead. Then I felt it move. I pulled. The wolf's body convulsed, working with me despite its weakness, and the pup slid free in a rush of fluid and blood. I caught it in my trembling hands, clearing its airways, expecting to see the tiny muzzle and closed eyes of a newborn wolf cub. What I saw instead made the world stop. The creature in my hands was an infant, a human infant with perfect tiny fingers and a scrunch-faced expression of newborn outrage. But even as I stared, its form flickered. For a heartbeat, I saw the wolf cub it should have been. Then human again. Back and forth, shifting between forms with each breath, unable to settle into either shape. Its eyes opened, and I nearly dropped it. Molten gold. Not the amber of wolves or the brown of humans, but actual gold, glowing from within like captured sunlight. Ancient. Terrible. Divine. "Goddess above," I whispered, the words barely audible over the storm. "You're a true shifter." The bloodline was supposed to be extinct. The histories said they'd died out 1,000 years ago, before the packs had split into hierarchies, when alphas and omegas could still bond without shame. True shifters could move between forms at will, could speak to both wolves and humans, could bridge the gap between instinct and reason. They were the original royalty, the gods touched, and I was holding one in my blood-soaked hands. The soul shield flickered, and I swayed on my knees. There were 2 more pups still inside the mother, and I was running out of strength. Outside, I heard Adravos's voice cutting through the storm, commanding his guards to search every structure. The infant shifted again, settling finally into wolf form, and let out a thin, reedy cry that somehow cut through the magical barrier I'd erected. The torches stopped moving. They'd heard it. The soul shield shattered like glass. I felt it break apart in my mind, each fragment a knife of pain that drove through my skull. The amber light winked out, plunging the cabin back into shadow save for the dying fire. I collapsed forward, barely catching myself on one hand while the other clutched the newborn true shifter against my chest. Blood roared in my ears, my vision tunneled to a single point of light. Then the door exploded inward. The heavy oak didn't just open, it splintered, torn from its hinges by a force that was more rage than strength. Shards of wood flew across the cabin, and through the opening stepped a figure that blocked out the moonlight entirely. Adravos. He was exactly as I remembered, and somehow worse. Taller than any man had a right to be, his shoulders broad enough to fill the doorframe. His dark hair was wild from the storm, ice clinging to the ends, and his eyes, goddess, his eyes, blazed crimson. Not the warm amber of a calm alpha, but the blood red of an apex predator seconds from the kill. His sword was in his hand before I could even think to move, the blade leveled at my throat with the precision of a man who'd killed 1,000 times before. Behind him, I could see his elite guards fanning out, their weapons drawn, their faces hidden behind steel masks. You. The word was barely human. It came from somewhere deep in his chest, wrapped in a growl that vibrated through the floorboards. He stepped into the cabin, his massive boots crunching on broken wood, and his eyes locked onto mine with such hatred that I felt it like a physical weight. Recognition flickered across his face, followed immediately by something darker. Betrayal, fury, the absolute certainty that he'd found the monster his counsel had warned him about. You, he said again, and this time the word carried the weight of judgment. His gaze dropped to the newborn in my arms, to my hands covered in blood and birthing fluid, to the amber glow still fading from my skin. His lip curled back from his teeth. What have you done to her? I tried to speak, but my voice was gone. Exhausted beyond words, drained to the point where even breathing felt like a monumental effort. All I could do was shake my head, a useless denial that meant nothing to a man who'd already decided I was guilty. The mother wolf lay behind me, her breathing shallow, her body still heavy with the 2 remaining pups. She looked like death itself, her black fur matted with blood and poison, her amber eyes barely open. Edravos saw her and went utterly still. The rage on his face transformed into something worse, anguish so profound it cracked through his fury like lightning through stone. Lyris, he breathed, and hearing him speak her name, recognizing the wolf as a person, as someone he loved, made something in my chest break. What did this traitor do to you? He raised his sword, and I knew with absolute certainty that he was going to kill me. Not arrest me, not question me, kill me, right here, right now, while I held his sister's newborn child in my blood-soaked hands. I closed my eyes and pulled the infant closer to my chest, shielding it with my body. The blade whistled through the air. Then the howl came. It wasn't loud. It wasn't the fierce battle cry of a warrior or the territorial warning of a predator. It was soft, melodic, the kind of sound a mother makes to soothe a frightened pup. But it carried a resonance that stopped everything. The blade froze inches from my throat. The guards' weapons lowered. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Lyris had lifted her head, and though her body trembled with the effort, she held Edravos's gaze. The howl continued, low and steady, and I watched as his crimson eyes flickered, then widened. She was speaking to him. Not in words, but in the psychic language that bound royal guardians to their alpha. I couldn't hear what she said, but I could see its effect. The sword fell from his hand, clattering against the floor. Edravos dropped to his knees, his face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. His eyes moved from his sister to me, then to the infant in my arms, seeing it truly for the first time. Seeing the flickering shift between forms, the golden eyes, the impossible truth. "She's protecting you," he whispered, and the words sounded like they'd been torn from somewhere deep inside him. "She's protecting you from me." The infant chose that moment to shift fully into human form and let out a lusty wail. And in the silence that followed, everything changed. Lyris convulsed, her body arching off the floor as another contraction seized her. The second pup was coming whether we were ready or not. I moved on instinct, passing the wailing infant to the nearest guard, who took it with trembling hands and positioned myself at Lyris's hindquarters once more. "Help me," I rasped to Edravos, my voice raw and barely audible. "She can't push. The poison weakened her too much." For a heartbeat, he didn't move. Then something shifted in his crimson eyes, and he was beside me, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as they supported his sister's frame. I reached inside, found the second pup, and pulled. It came easier this time, sliding into the world in a rush of fluid. Another true shifter, this one settling immediately into human form, a tiny girl with the same tufts of black hair and those impossible golden eyes. The moment she drew her first breath, the world turned gold. Light exploded from the infant, not the amber of my Omega magic, but pure, radiant gold that spread outward in a sphere. It crashed over us like a wave, and suddenly I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The cabin disappeared. Idravos's presence beside me vanished. Everything dissolved into light. Then the visions came. I was standing in the great hall, but I was seeing it through my own eyes, as if reliving a memory I'd tried desperately to forget. I felt the bite of iron shackles around my wrists, felt the eyes of the entire pack boring into me as I stood before the throne, and I felt the terror, soul deep and paralyzing, as General Malachor read the charges against me. But this time, I wasn't alone in the memory. I felt Idravos there with me, trapped in the vision, forced to experience everything I had felt that night. The confusion when I didn't understand what I'd supposedly done. The desperation when I tried to explain. The shattering moment when I realized no one would believe me. The vision shifted, pulling us both to a shadowed alcove outside the hall. I watched. We both watched, as Malachor pressed a heavy bag into the hands of the witnesses who'd testified against me. The clink of gold coins was obscenely loud in the silence. The witnesses nodded, counted the coins, and smiled. "She suspects nothing," one of them said. "By tomorrow she'll be gone, and the king will never know what he's lost." The vision shifted again, more violently this time. Now we were in the royal kennels, and Malachor stood before Lyris in her wolf form. She was snarling, trying to warn others, trying to communicate what she'd overheard. But Malachor just smiled and pulled a vial from his robes. "The bloodline dies tonight," he said softly, almost tenderly, as he poured wolfsbane ash into her water bowl. "My son will be heir, and the king will never know the difference. True shifters are myths anyway. These abominations your womb carries will die with you in the woods, where they belong." Lyris drank because she was thirsty, because she trusted the man who'd served her brother for 20 years. We felt the poison hit her system, felt her realization come too late, felt her desperate flight into the storm to reach the only person who might save what remained. The exiled Omega, the one the king had thrown away. The vision shifted one final time, and now we were standing in a place I didn't recognize, a sacred grove where the old magic still hummed in the air. Two figures stood facing each other, surrounded by swirling silver light. It took me a moment to realize one of them was me, younger, standing before a massive male wolf whose eyes I knew even in animal form. Idravos. The fated mate bond snapped into place between us like a physical thing, silver threads weaving our souls together. I felt his shock, his recognition, his absolute certainty that this was right, that this was meant to be. Then I saw Malachor again, watching from the shadows with cold calculation in his eyes. "A healer as his mate," he murmured to himself. "She would have more influence than any of us. The Omega must be eliminated." The golden light shattered, and we were thrown back into our bodies with enough force to knock the breath from our lungs. I collapsed against the floor, gasping. Beside me, Idravos made a sound I'd never heard from an alpha, a broken, anguished keen that spoke of a world turned upside down. The third pup was crowning, and I reached for it with shaking hands, pulling the final true shifter into a world that had just learned the depth of its own corruption. Edravos lifted his head, and his eyes found mine. They were no longer crimson. They were amber, warm and horrified, and full of a grief so profound it made my chest ache. "Caliph," he breathed, saying my name for the first time in 3 months. "What have I done?" The silence that followed was deafening. The golden light had faded, leaving only the dim flicker of firelight and the soft mewling of 3 newborn true shifters. I held the third pup against my chest, my arms trembling with exhaustion, and couldn't bring myself to look at him. What have I done? The question echoed in my mind, bouncing off the walls of every wound his judgment had carved into my soul. What have you done? You destroyed me. You cast me out to die. You called me a taint and a curse in front of everyone I'd ever known, but I was too tired for anger, too empty for rage. I just knelt there on the blood-soaked floor, 3 impossible lives cradled in my arms, and waited for whatever came next. The clatter of steel against wood made me flinch. I looked up to find Edravos' sword lying on the floor between us, the blade still gleaming in the firelight. He was staring at it as if seeing it for the first time, as if the weapon he'd carried for 20 years had suddenly become unrecognizable. Then, to my absolute shock, the Alpha King dropped to one knee. Not the performative kneel of a lord to his subjects, not the ceremonial bow of respect between equals. This was the kind of kneel that came from a man whose legs could no longer hold his weight, whose world had shattered so completely that gravity itself had become unbearable. He pressed his fist to his chest, over his heart, and bowed his head. "Forgive me." The words were barely a whisper, broken and raw. Coming from the most powerful man in the North, they sounded like a prayer to a god who'd long since stopped listening. "Caliph, please, forgive me." I should have felt satisfaction, vindication, some small measure of justice for the 3 months I'd spent waiting to die. But all I felt was hollow, scraped clean of everything except exhaustion and the weight of 3 newborn lives depending on me to stay conscious. My voice cracked. I tried again. "I don't know if I can." He flinched as if I'd struck him, but he didn't lift his head. His massive hands, capable of tearing apart enemies with ease, trembled against his chest. "I was blind," he said, and his voice was breaking on every word. "They lied to me. About you, about the bond, about everything. And I believed them because it was easier than questioning men I'd trusted my entire life. Because it was easier than admitting an Omega could be my equal." Behind him, his guards stood frozen, their weapons still drawn but forgotten. I could see the shock on their faces, the dawning horror as they realized what the vision had shown them. "You saved her," Edravos continued, finally lifting his head to meet my eyes. His were amber now, warm and devastated and full of a grief that matched the one carved into my bones. "You saved Lyris when anyone else would have let her die. You saved my heirs, true shifters, goddess, above, when the entire High Council plotted to destroy them before they could be born." He reached out slowly, telegraphing the movement so I could pull away if I wanted. His hand hovered over the third pup, the one still settling between forms in my arms. "Your Omega magic didn't just save my sister," he whispered. "It saved the future of my line. It saved the kingdom, and I repaid you by calling you a curse." The pup shifted fully into human form, a tiny boy with golden eyes that watched Edravos with ancient wisdom. The Alpha King's hand trembled as he finally made contact, one finger brushing against impossibly small fingers. The fated mate bond, which had been screaming between us since the vision, suddenly flared to life. I felt it snap into place with brutal certainty, the silver threads that had always been there, hidden beneath layers of lies and poison and deliberate manipulation. It hummed between us now, undeniable, demanding to be acknowledged. I wanted to reject it, wanted to tell him that forgiveness wasn't something he could demand just because the truth had finally surfaced. My heart was still scarred, still bleeding from the rejection that had nearly killed me. But as I watched him cradle his newborn heir with shaking hands, as I felt Lyrus's weakening pulse through our blood bond, as I looked at the 3 true shifters who represented either salvation or destruction for an entire kingdom, I understood something with crushing clarity. To save the kingdom, I would first have to find a way to heal the bond between us, even if it meant reopening every wound his judgment had left behind. "Get up," I said quietly. "We have work to do." Adravos rose slowly, his eyes never leaving mine, and in them I saw something I'd never seen before: hope wrapped in desperation. The king had finally learned to kneel. Now we would see if he could learn to stand beside an Omega as an equal. We didn't return as refugees seeking mercy. We returned as a storm. Adravos stripped the royal furs from his own shoulders and wrapped them around me without a word, the heavy fabric still warm from his body. I wanted to refuse, to cling to my anger like armor, but the cold had seeped too deep into my bones. I let him drape me in crimson and gold, while his guards wrapped the 3 true shifter pups in silk that shimmered in the torchlight. He carried Lyrus himself, cradling his sister's wolf form against his chest, with a tenderness that made something crack in my carefully maintained walls. She was weak, but alive, her breathing steadier now that the poison had been filtered from her blood. I walked beside him, the 3 pups secured against my chest in a makeshift sling, and felt the weight of 1,000 eyes as we moved through the forest. The journey back took 2 days. 2 days of Adravos's guards treating me like something precious and fragile, offering me food and water and deference I'd never received even before my exile. 2 days of the Alpha King, walking beside me in silence, the fated mate bond humming between us like an unspoken question neither of us was ready to answer. We reached the capital at dawn. The timing was perfect in the worst possible way. As we approached the main gates, I could see a crowd gathered in the central square. Banners hung from the palace walls, black and silver, the colors of mourning. Through the gates, I caught a glimpse of General Malachor standing on the palace steps, dressed in ceremonial robes, preparing to address the assembled nobility. He was declaring himself regent, claiming the throne in the absence of an heir. Adravos's eyes flashed crimson, but his voice remained deadly calm. "Open the gates." The guards at the entrance stared at us as if we were ghosts. Their eyes went wide, taking in their king alive and whole, the exiled Omega wrapped in his furs, and the massive black wolf in his arms. One of them dropped his spear. It clattered against stone, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent square. We walked through the gates side by side. The effect was instantaneous. The crowd parted like water, nobles stumbling over each other to back away. I heard gasps, whispers, someone's voice rising in shock. "The Omega! She's alive!" Malachor froze mid-speech, his face draining of color as he saw us approach. His eyes locked on mine, and I watched understanding dawn, followed immediately by fear. I stood taller, pulling the royal furs tighter around my shoulders. The 3 pups shifted in their sling, and one of them let out a small cry. A soldier near the palace steps caught a glimpse of golden eyes, and his spear fell from nerveless fingers. "True shifters," someone breathed, and the whisper spread through the crowd like wildfire. I was no longer the shivering ghost who'd barely survived the frozen wastes. I was the woman who'd saved the king's sister, who'd delivered 3 impossible heirs, who'd survived poison and exile and the High Council's lies. I was the woman who held the Alpha King's soul in one hand and the kingdom's future in the other. Adravos stopped at the base of the palace steps, forcing Malachor to look down at us. When he spoke, his voice carried across the square with the weight of absolute authority. "General Malachor," he said, each word precise and cold as winter. "You have exactly one chance to explain why the royal guardian was poisoned, why my mate was exiled on false charges, and why you're standing on my steps wearing a crown that doesn't belong to you." The silence that followed was absolute. I met Malachor's eyes and smiled. Let him try to lie now, with the truth standing before him wrapped in the king's own furs. The purge was swift and brutal. Malachor's attempts to deny everything shattered the moment Adravos allowed the true shifters to share their mother's memories with the assembled court. The psychic vision that erupted from the pups left no room for doubt, no space for lies. Within hours, Malachor and 6 other council members were stripped of their titles and exiled to the same frozen wastes where they'd sent me to die. I didn't feel satisfaction watching them dragged away in chains. I felt nothing but tired relief that it was finally over. The trials lasted 3 days. Every witness who testified against me came forward to confess, their bags of gold evidence enough to condemn them. The council chambers were scrubbed clean of corruption, and new members were appointed, including, to my shock, me. The position of High Guardian and Great Healer, Adravos announced before the entire court, his hand resting on my shoulder, will be held by Calith, my mate, and the savior of the royal line. She is the first Omega to hold a seat of power, and she will not be the last. The law of exile was struck down that same day, burned in the central square while the pack watched. No one would ever again be cast into the frozen wastes to die alone. No one would ever again be deemed too weak, too broken, too inconvenient to deserve protection. 3 months passed before I could truly breathe again. I stood on the palace balcony now, watching the first green shoots of spring push through the melting snow. The garden below was alive with color after the long winter, crocuses and snowdrops dotting the landscape like promises of better things to come. And tumbling through it all, 3 pups who shifted between forms with gleeful abandon, their golden eyes bright with laughter. Lyris, restored to her human form by the combined efforts of every healer in the kingdom, sat on a bench nearby. She was beautiful in a way that took my breath away. Sharp features, dark hair shot through with silver, and those same intelligent amber eyes. She caught me watching and smiled, raising a hand in acknowledgement. Warm arms wrapped around my waist from behind, and I leaned back into Adravos's solid presence. He rested his chin on top of my head, and together we watched his sister's children, his heirs, play in the sun. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "Saving her, saving them, saving me." I thought about the cabin in the frozen wastes, about the hollow ache of exile, about the night a dying wolf had scratched at my door and changed everything. I thought about the scars his rejection had left, still tender but healing, and the bond between us that had been broken and carefully, painfully rebuilt. "No," I said finally and meant it. "I don't regret fighting for what was right." His arms tightened around me, and I felt his breath against my hair. I spent my whole life being told that strength meant dominance, that alphas ruled and omegas served. It took nearly losing everything to learn the truth. And what's that? That real strength is knowing when to kneel. Below us, one of the pups, the first one I'd delivered, the boy with black hair, shifted mid-tumble and landed on his feet in human form. He looked up at us and waved, his golden eyes gleaming with joy. I waved, back, feeling something unfurl in my chest that might have been hope. I was no longer defined by the rejection that had nearly destroyed me. I was defined by the lives I'd saved, by the laws I'd changed, by the king who'd finally learned to see past his own blind certainty. I was the High Guardian, the Great Healer, the primal anchor who'd tethered an alpha's wild power and taught him what it meant to be whole. The spring sun warmed my face, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something I'd thought lost forever. I felt like I was home. I know the story has shifted something in you as you have walked with me to the end of this story. If you're new to this channel, kindly comment your thoughts and hit the subscribe button as part of your great support towards the growth of this community we're building. Thanks for watching.